I studied Nazi doctors during the late 70s and early 80s, and there I encountered what I called a reversal of healing and killing. It was a vast a form of apocalyptic biology in which there was this visionary idea of eliminating bad races and bad genes in order to purify the world, mostly Jews, but also gypsies, Slavs, homosexuals, and various religious groups, in a utopian, creating a utopian world devoid of all these bad genes. It was a vision of killing to heal, and I began to realize that subsequently that apocalyptic visions in general may not involve the literal killing to heal of Nazi doctors, but have that kind of image of destroying to heal or killing to heal. Unfortunately, I find some reverberations of Nazi doctors in American doctors in Abu Ghraib. They're in no way to be equated with Nazi doctors, not at all. Nonetheless, it's true, and there's evidence for this, and I wrote a small piece in the New England Journal of Medicine about it. It's quite clear that American doctors at Abu Ghraib were complicit with the torture there in at least three ways: not reporting injuries that could only be caused by torture, turning over medical records to interrogators, if not at Abu Ghraib and other places, in order to search out weak points or vulnerabilities of prisoners, and falsifying or delaying death certificates. Again, some of these were at Abu Ghraib, some were in Guantanamo, and some in Afghanistan. Falsifying and delaying death certificates to convey the sense, at least initially, that people had died of natural causes or medical reasons rather than died at the hands of mistreatment in prison. Again, not to equate them with Nazi doctors, but the reverberations are all too much there. In my later study of Aum Shinrikyo in the late 90s in Japan, one encountered the completely apocalyptic cult or cultic movement. Aum Shinrikyo was a relatively small cult. It had just 10,000 people in Japan, quite a number in Russia at that time, although they were loosely organized, and only 1,400 so-called monks who were most active in the eventual violence and who lived with and under the guru. What one has to say about Aum Shinrikyo, in addition to the fact that they killed about 100 people altogether in various ways, is that they had this vision in which they would release large amounts of sarin gas, which they tried to do, in Tokyo. The Japanese would think the Americans had done it. The Americans would think the Japanese had done it. Other countries would join in what would become World War III, which would then produce a biblical Armageddon and a world renewal. Wild fantasy, of course, but fantasy connected with the creation of weapons of mass destruction, sarin gas and other forms of poison gas, and various forms of biological weaponry. They produced them awkwardly and incompletely, fortunately, and they also sought very hard to obtain nuclear weapons or uranium or either already made nuclear weapons or scientists who could make them for them, trying to locate and bribe disaffected scientists in Russia for that purpose, and for which, fortunately, they were unsuccessful. There's another aspect that's important to mention about Aum Shinrikyo. They followed a principle known in the ancient Hebrew literature as forcing the end. In that ancient literature, as described by Gershon Scholem, a great authority on these issues, there developed various kinds of discussions among rabbis about whether it was justified or necessary to join in the violence which had to occur prior to the appearance of the Messiah. Fortunately, the rabbis decided that that was wrong and heretical, because only God could make such decisions. But certain contemporary cults, including Om Shinrikyo, had no such restraint and were intent upon contributing to Armageddon by joining in the process and making it happen. And indeed, the existence of nuclear weapons and, in some degree, other weapons of mass destruction contributes to that impulse to join in that way of forcing the end. No doubt these studies sound pretty grim, but throughout my work there's also been a theme of alternatives to apocalyptic violence, emphasizing the resilience of the self and of certain groups in terms of what I call the protean self, named after the Greek god of many shapes, allowing us considerable fluidity and the possibility of avoiding dead ends, the protean self being in some measure stimulated by various historical developments, including the confusions of contemporary history, and the protean self contrasting with the fundamentalist self, which seeks straight and narrow absolute principles and beliefs. If one says a little bit more about apocalyptic violence, one has to recognize that it's a product of the apocalyptic imagination. The word apocalypse derives from a Greek term for revelation or uncovering, but it has come to mean the uncovering or revelation of visions or prophecies of the end of the world. So apocalyptic violence tends to be large-scale violence that destroys the entire world or large segments of it, always in the service of an idealized, much yearned for, renewal and purification. And it's that promise of renewal and purification that can make the idea of apocalyptic violence so compelling. It also appeals to the human impulse toward spiritual or ethical improvement and toward rendering one's death significant, as in this case becoming part of a sacred mission or something eternal. Apocalyptic violence is everywhere, even though we often don't recognize it or call it that. Even here at home, if you look at Timothy McVeigh, who killed 160 people with a bomb that he released in Oklahoma City, we think of him as someone who was angry at his country and a loner, but it turns out that he had hoped that this would be the beginning of a chain reaction. And his favorite book, which he slept with under his pillow, is the Turner Diaries, which is probably the ugliest volume since Mein Kampf, maybe even uglier. In any case, this volume describes how the, quotes, white patriots mount a successful revolution against the American government, which they have decided is too soft on blacks and Jews, and the revolution succeeds, and then they systematically exterminate all non-whites and Jews, first in North and South America and then throughout the world. You couldn't be more apocalyptic than that, and this is the book that McVeigh loved and gave to friends and sold at gun shows, etc. Or if you look at the contending sides in the Middle East, the Israelis and the Palestinians, Hamas has an apocalyptic promise of jihad, and some of the Jewish extremists, like the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin, have their own apocalyptic agenda, so that a man named Amir, who murdered Rabin, did so not only because he wanted to interfere with the peace process, which he did, but also because he thought that Rabin, in offering to negotiate, quotes, Jewish land, to give away, quotes, Jewish land, would delay the appearance of the Messiah. In other words, apocalyptic thinking and attendant violence is widespread, emerges from just about every major religious group in the world, and has an impulse toward what I call the ownership of death.